Just want to take it in for a second. I always like it at the beginning of a convening just to look and see all the friendly faces in the room. So fellows, colleagues, and I mean that in fellows in a very gender neutral kind of way. Colleagues, friends, Wertheim family members. I am thrilled to welcome all of you to our celebration of 100 years of the Wertheim Fellowship Fund. For those of you I don't know, I'm Sharon Block. I'm a professor here at Harvard Law School and executive director of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy. And I want to start by, if our fellows who are with us could just raise their hands. It's fun to see all the people. And if I could ask the family members who have some come from. So the journey to today has really been a fascinating one for us at the Center for Labor and a Just Economy. It began with the realization that we knew a lot about the amazing contributions to the field of labor relations that Wertheim Fellows have made, but that we knew very little about how the gift that has enabled those conversations, how that gift came to be. Where's Jack? Even Jack Trumpworth, who many of you know, our director of research, who knows everything about the labor movement and everything about Harvard, didn't know much about the origins of this wonderful gift. So we have actually spent more than a year digging into the circumstances that gave rise to this gift that we value so much. And we have learned a lot. We learned about how a poor immigrant began rolling cigars in New York City and then built a major cigar manufacturing company, and later in life spent time advocating for a vision of our economy that lifted up working people as a partner with capital, not an adversary. Quite a vision for the 1920s, or even for the 2020s. But before we go any further in today's celebration, I have to recognize the incredible amount of work that has gone into this year of preparation by my colleagues at the center. They have become genealogists, historians, archivists, and many other things, in addition to doing their regular day jobs, which have been quite busy over the past year. In particular, I want to thank Yuri Chang for her amazing work. For the Wertheim family members with us, you probably all know Yuri by now. She has spent time with many of you, sometimes learning about your family from you, and sometimes even teaching you about aspects of your family that you didn't even know. So you and our panelists have experienced firsthand Yuri's remarkable intellect, patience, organizational skills, and compassion. So I'm incredibly grateful to Yuri, Thea, Vonda, Giovanni, and the rest of our team. And they really deserve the credit for what I'm sure is going to be an interesting and enriching and fun afternoon and evening. One bit of housekeeping. I want to give you all a heads up that we are recording this event so we can share it with folks, with our fellows and family members who are able to be with us today. So just be aware of that. But also be aware, if you see these discs up here with the green light, those are our microphones. They are very sensitive. So you might think you're having a private conversation at your table. Somebody might hear that conversation when they play back the recording of this event. So just be warned. Okay. Now, it is my honor to introduce John Goldberg, who is the Morgan and Helen Chu Dean and Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. We're very grateful to Dean Goldberg for taking time out of his very busy schedule. You might think we had graduation last week, so like all academics, he takes the summer off, and I can assure you that is not true. And we're particularly honored that he came all the way over here to the other side of campus. This is actually kind of a distance from the HLS campus. But most relevant for today, we are grateful to him for creating an environment at HLS that values our contribution to the school by producing research, scholarship, and policy development that explores the role of working people in our economy, society, and democracy. Wow.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for that very nice introduction. It is a long way. About 3/4 of a mile or 40 minutes. Because this is Cambridge. No, really, thank you so much. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here, and delighted to be able to join Sharon and the other of your hosts in welcoming you to this celebration. Let me especially thank the members of the remarkable Wertheim family, many of whom are here today, including my colleague. Where's Henry? Oh, there's Henry. Henry Steiner, who founded, as you may know, Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program, and more importantly, on this occasion, had the good sense to join the Wertheim family, marrying one of Jacob's granddaughters, Pam. The family has contributed to Harvard in countless ways. Several of the family members have been educated here, starting with, I gather, Jacob's son, Maurice. I understand this evening you will spend some time in the Wertheim Gallery at the Harvard Art Museum, which houses the incredible art collection that Maurice donated to Harvard. Jessica Matthews, another of Jacob's granddaughters, served on the board of the Harvard Corporation, and yet another granddaughter, Barbara Tuchman, attended Radcliffe and received an honorary degree in 1984. So we are truly grateful for the association of Harvard in its many dimensions and the Wertheim family in its many dimensions. Of course, the gift we're here today to really honor, as Sharon mentioned, is the one we're now in the 100-year legacy of this gift of Emma Wertheim and her 5 children, made in her memory, in memory of her husband Jacob. The terms of the gift are relatively simple: to supply funds which will enable experts to pursue research that will help solve problems in the vital field of industrial relations. Now, some gifts, are used to build buildings, but the simple words of the Wertheim Fellowship gift have quite literally helped build a field of study. And that's a huge deal. We are an academic institution first and foremost, and we love our buildings, but more importantly, we love the scholarly enterprise. And that is what this gift has been all about. It has supported, as your program tells you, 55 books on the labor movement and worker collective action, tons of other scholarship, the work of secretaries of labor, leading labor economists, lawyers, historians, practitioners, and many others. And I couldn't be prouder that that's part of our enterprise at Harvard Law School. My understanding is you're going to spend this afternoon in this lovely building. Sharon suggested I build a similar building on the law school campus. Many of you have some money lying around. But you're going to spend the afternoon addressing really, obviously, deep and important and pressing questions about how work has been and will be affected by everything from climate change and artificial intelligence to the stresses that our political system is currently experiencing. And this is exactly as it should be. It's a demonstration of the critical contributions to the field that are being made and will continue to be made by the work of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy with the support of the Wertheim Fund. So I'm thrilled that that's what we're going to be doing here today. I can't wait to hear about it. For now, all I will say is enjoy lunch, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Okay. Union in many dimensions. Okay, next, where's Elaine? There you are. I am so happy to introduce Elaine Bernard, who is a current Wertheim Fellow herself. Elaine was my predecessor as the executive director of our program from 1989 to 2017. I can assure you, I will not beat that longevity record. She's the scholar of the labor movement and a prominent labor educator. And Elaine's own prominence in the field and her collaborative spirit throughout her almost 30 years administering the Wertheim Fund explains the success of the fund in attracting such great talents. So I can't imagine anyone better qualified to share a short history of the Wertheim Fund and the fellows who have made it truly one of the most prestigious labor fellowships in the country.
Thank you, Sharon. It occurred to me that all the people who get Wertheim fellowships, sort of, the first question one should ask is, who the hell is Wertheim? Who was Jacob Wertheim? Well, he was born in Connecticut in 1858, and he started work himself at the age of 14, and he started work in the cigar business. And you may not know, but the cigar business is a very interesting industry in that it's hand-grown cigars. And one of the things that the cigar workers used to do is take one of their members off the line and pay them to read to them, read the news, so that while they were working, they were also being educated. And a very interesting industry. Well, he worked in that and many other industries for over 40 years in business. He became a highly successful manufacturer and entrepreneur. And at the time he retired, and frankly, he didn't retire, he redeployed. He deployed at the age of 55 years old. And when he retired, he was president of the United Cigar Manufacturing Company. He had built a public corporation worth over $20 million. He had also been a director at General Motors, Underwood Typewriter, and director of several large industrial, real estate interests. He also was a founding member of the Federation for the Support of Jewish Philanthropic Societies. So he always thought charities as being very important. And in an interview in the New York Times, this is how important he was as a businessman. He retires and he gets an interview in the New York Times in 1914. And they asked him why he was retiring. He said, I want to retire because I have an interest in my charitable work and exploring profit sharing. And let me read a couple of quotes from him. He said, lest employers of labor make no mistake, it is written on the wall that business of the future to be successful must come to a profit sharing basis, and it is a subject they should seriously consider. I am not an alarmist, he said, but the world has progressed and is going forward with more. The discontent that exists amongst laboring men must be faced squarely, not merely in an effort at self-preservation, but in a spirit of justice and acknowledgement of right. Labor must get the share to which it is entitled. He further went on and talked a little bit about his profit sharing method and said that the net results of the combined efforts of capital and labor should, on some just, be apportioned to both agencies that have actually helped in the production of these results. So what is the Jacob Wertheim Research Fellowship? Well, upon his death, the family decided to donate money to Harvard to create this fellowship. And son Marisa Wertheim actually wrote some really good comments about what they were thinking of. Speaking for the family said, and I quote, "My father's greatest interest in the latter part of his life was the general philanthropy, especially in improving industrial relations. He had many original ideas on the subject of profit sharing and wrote and spoke to a great deal in support of his plan for spreading profit sharing systems." But why Harvard? There are a lot of universities. Well, of course, Maurice Wertheim had been a graduate, both the BA and an MA from Harvard. But he said, "My father was a man of liberal tendencies, sympathizing with the viewpoint of labor as well as capital. He would have desired, as we do, that holders of the fellowship should have the fullest freedom of independent investigation and their conclusions. We chose Harvard to administer the fund, particularly because of the belief that it is and will continue to be the most liberal of American universities, and will administer the fund in the same liberal manner that characterized my father's views." So an extremely important view at this point in history, where you don't see a lot of discussion about liberal points of view. He said, "Why a fellowship?" Because, if you look at many of the endowments from Harvard, they go into professorship, they go into student scholarships, etc. He said, "We believe it will fill the greatest need, this fellowship. We investigated the matter very thoroughly and found that there seems to be a large amount of money available for professorships and scholarships, but very little for any real research information about industrial cooperation. And the result is very helpful suggestions to have an expert devote his time to the study of the field." And it became a prescient call, which he noted, and quoted him. "We hope that the investigations carried on under this fellowship do something to throw light on the problems that are now more or less steeped in darkness. There was never a time when the enlightened settlement of economic questions were more necessary." Very impressive. Well, what happened? Well, the world of industrialization and industrial relations, the field, has gone through a lot of changes in the 100 years of the Wertheim Fellowship. And in fact, if we look at when it was started, at the very beginning of the 20th century, the field of industrial relations didn't actually exist. Remember, we're over by the Harvard Business School. It didn't come into existence until 1905. So the whole notion of industrial relations as a study. And Wertheim Fellowship, one of the first holders of the fellowship was a very famous labor economist who, through the fellowship, was invited to Harvard, first as a fellow, and that was Sumner Schlichter, whose name for an older generation was synonymous with labor economics. And for many years, Sumner ran a seminar that had top economists from both MIT and Harvard, and many students coming to hear some of the fellows who were invited to speak, as well as students. And in fact, Schlichter became the inaugural Lamont University professor at Harvard in 1936 because of his work on the Wertheim Fellow. Sumner then was the chair of the Wertheim Fellowship faculty committee, and for most of the 40s and 50s, he very much directed their studies, attracted students, faculties, and practitioners, which was something that was very important for Harvard. After Sumner passed away, his another top economist who he had helped mentor, John T. Dunlop, became the new Lamont University professor, and he was later secretary of the And it was Dunlop who then became the director. And Schwechter and Dunlop basically saw that Wertheim Fellows played a pivotal role in establishing the very discipline of industrial relations, not just at Harvard, but nationally. The notion of a multidisciplinary field examining the dynamic relationships amongst employers, employees, government, and society. And they had an appreciation and analysis of the complex relationships and systems pertaining to the production of goods, services, and in fact, even caregiving in our society. And that they understood the need to understand very different forces and structures and complexities in what was indeed a system and systems. And of course, during the life of the Wertheim Fellowship, we had massive changes, whether the legal change, economic change, everything from the Wagner Act, National Labor Relations Act, to World War II. And in fact, with World War II, a massive challenge that the society and education was facing, which is how do you take a new generation of labor leaders and business people who, have not been doing very much during the Great Depression and move them into STEAM and working cooperatively together in this international emergency. Well, and that's where the Wertheim helped inaugurate what became the Harvard Trade Union Program. Modestly, it predated a similar program a little bit later that the business school brought in for business leaders, but made the record show that the Harvard Trade Union Program was the first to do this, and it still exists since 1942. And again, we can thank the Wertheim for development and some of the ideas around it. And so Wertheim Fellows, so how did it end up where it currently is, which is under the leadership of Sharon as executive director, Ben Sachs from the law school, and Richard Freeman, who can't be with us here today, from the economics department, as the folks who oversee it. Well, basically, when John Dunlop passed away, we had, meaning Paul Weiler, Richard Freeman, and myself, had worked very closely with John on the Wertheim Fellowship and became convinced of its importance and significance, and actually were able to persuade the people at Harvard that its happiest state would be with what was then the Labor and Work-Life Program, but today is the great Center for Labor and a Just Economy. And under that umbrella, it continues to have a relationship with practitioners through the Harvard Trade Union Program, and as well as fellows who are brought in from fields as diverse as, as pensions, as international labor, as worker ownership, to new systems of labor relations, new market institutions, changing composition of the workforce, the role of external things like the changes in the environment, et cetera. All of those things fit into the very broad and beautiful mandate set up by Wertheim in creating this fellowship on labor and on the betterment of industrial relations. So it's not just the betterment of industrial relations, it was actually part and parcel of the creation of the academic field of labor relations. So thank you.
Thank you. Oh, is that back on? Okay, thank you, Elaine. And thank you for all you did to bring the Wertheim Fellowship to our program. Okay, now you all have a better idea of why we are so proud of our Wertheim Fellows and the contributions that they have made. As I'm sure you can also all imagine, and as Elaine's history of the fund makes clear, over 100 years, there have been a lot of Wertheim Fellows. And it would be impossible to share what this fellowship has meant for all of them. So I want to share with you some thoughts from just one of our fellows, albeit one of our most illustrious fellows, Ray Marshall, a highly respected labor economist and the Secretary of Labor in the Carter administration. Unfortunately, Ray could not be with us today. He's unable to travel anymore from his home in Austin, Texas, but he did want to be sort of in the room with us nonetheless. So these are remarks from Ray Marshall, from Secretary Marshall. The Jacob Wertheim Fellowship was very important to my career for a number of reasons. First, it enabled me to transform my PhD dissertation into a book, Labor in the South, for the Harvard University Press. John Dunlop, who we just heard about, who offered me the fellowship, had very useful research materials at Harvard that were not available elsewhere. John also gave me valuable advice about that project. Second, Cambridge was a very good place in 1959 and 1960 for an aspiring labor economist. There was close cooperation between faculty and graduate student labor specialists at Harvard and MIT. I audited John Dunlop's labor economics classes and Archibald Cox's labor law classes and participated in the Harvard Trade Union program, which for those of you who don't know, we still run today. Third, I learned a lot from John Dunlop and other Harvard and MIT professors about dispute settlement and consensus building. This experience helped me in my career as an arbitrator and mediator. It was especially important for my responsibilities as Secretary of Labor. An important lesson I learned from John was how to create consensus building processes between labor, management, and the government. He had developed the model for this work with a construction coordinating committee in Chicago. This committee established a bid calendar that distributed construction work throughout the year, thus reducing construction costs and seasonal unemployment, which in turn reduced unemployment compensation costs. When I became labor secretary, we expanded construction coordinating committees to other cities and created tripartite labor management and government committees to help the steel, auto, and airline industries adjust to a much more competitive and knowledge-intensive economy. That might sound familiar. All of the parties involved in these committees agreed that the process helped them understand their own industries much better, thus developing more effective policies. We also created a tripartite committee, which John Dunlop chaired, to help develop policies to address economic problems like inflation and an increasingly competitive global economy. Fourth, the Harvard Trade Union program improved my understanding of the role of trade unions in the United States and other countries, and the usefulness of the comparative adaptive method for developing policies and programs to address important problems. It was very instructive to see how the participants from different countries learn from each other about their common challenges. Some of the participants in the Harvard Trade Union became political leaders in their countries, which is not surprising because of the evidence that democratic labor organizations are training grounds for democratic political leaders. Again, another dynamic that I think we are seeing again these days. I've worked closely with an alumnus of the Harvard Trade Union program, Anke Jorgensen, who became Prime Minister of Denmark. His labor minister, Svend Auken, and I formed the Copenhagen group of about 10 labor ministers to work jointly on important common problems. We called it the Copenhagen group because our first meeting was in Copenhagen, but we rotated subsequent meetings to other countries. Some of the important issues facing labor specialists include developing policies and programs to help workers and industries adjust to economic and technological change. It is particularly important for all of the stakeholders involved to develop processes like tripartite committees to address the challenges presented by AI. This technology has the potential to revolutionize productivity, efficiency, and economic growth, but it also has the potential to displace jobs, accelerate inequality, and create serious ethical problems. Next, promoting broadly shared prosperity to reverse the growing inequality of wealth and income, including improvements in minimum wages, health insurance, and education and training programs, and managing migration to maximize the important economic, political, and social benefit and minimize the negatives. These and many other examples demonstrate the value of the Wertheim Research Fellowship to me. I'm very grateful for having received it and sorry that I am unable to attend the symposium celebrating its 100th anniversary. And it really strikes me there is so much in Secretary Marshall's remarks that really describe the work that we continue to advance today. And I love that at 88 years old, Secretary Marshall is still thinking about what workers need at this moment and into the future. And that's exactly what our Wertheim Fellows do for us. They keep pushing to figure out what do we need to know to ensure that workers not just survive, but thrive in our country and around the world. And many working people are not thriving today. And I would argue that makes the work of CLJE and our Wertheim Fellows more urgent than ever. Our theory of our work at the center is that labor policy is critical to working people being able to have a good life. It is most working people spend the majority of their working hours at work. And if they don't feel dignity, and if they don't feel valued, if they cannot have the security of being able to support their families, at the end of the day, they just can't fully enjoy their life. They and their families can't flourish. In addition, we believe that we can only solve the big problems, the very big problems of the day, if working people have agency in the process of solving those problems. This theory makes us feel very aligned with Jacob's vision of the centrality of the dignity of work and workers in the success of our country. You can see this theory at work in the panels that are coming up. We've chosen to share with you the work that our program and our fellows are doing in 3 critical areas: climate, AI and tech, and labor law reform. And as you'll hear, we integrate the work of our Wertheim Fellows into everything we do. We lift up their research and use it to ground our inclusive policy problem solving. It's why we've come to serve as a resource for our colleagues around Harvard, among policymakers, and for organizations working throughout these 3 domains. As we're going to turn to our climate panel in just a minute. Let me give you just one example of this dynamic of how the Wertheim Fellowships and the work we do integrates all these different ideas. We've had a series of Wertheim Fellows, many of whom are in the room with us, with scholarly and practical experience thinking about the future of labor law. How can the law be reformed to fulfill the objective of facilitating worker power building? And these fellows have participated in one of our flagship projects, and I should add students too. Some of our students are here who have been part of these projects. Important part of what we do. Anyway, we called this flagship project the Clean Slate for Worker Power Project, in which we developed groundbreaking recommendations for labor law reform. I will note one of our big recommendations in our initial Clean Slate report was that the United States should move, like most of the rest of the world, to a sectoral bargaining system. Happy to, those of you who don't know what that is, to fill you in. I could talk about it forever. Just trust me, we don't do it, everybody else does it. When we made these recommendations in 2020, where's Ben? We got some blowback, I would say. Not everybody agreed with us. And now, just yesterday, a senator who is widely considered to be likely to run for president announced he's introducing a bill to, in fact, change the US labor law system to sectoral bargaining. So our ideas are really permeating the labor ecosystem. Anyway, so we had this big project, we made these big recommendations. The point was to have labor law build an equitable economy and democracy. So you might think that that means we focused on things like wages and jobs and benefits and unions being, supported by their members and things like that, which we did. But in addition, we engaged with climate scholars in doing this work to ensure the opportunity for workers to collectively contribute to advancing climate justice, because workers are on the front line of what is happening in this world as a result of rising temperatures. So that's why when we released our initial Clean Slate report, leading environmental organizations endorsed the report. And we couldn't have done or sustained all the work that has followed from that without our Wertheim Fellows. So we're very proud of what we do, and we are so grateful because we couldn't have done it without the Wertheim Fund. And now I'm going to turn it over to Yuri as we move on to the rest of our program.
Thank you so much, Sharon. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet yet, I'm Yuri Chang here with the Center for Labor and Economy. And I'd also like to add my thanks to you all for joining us here today. So at this point, I'm happy to introduce the panelists for the first 3 panels that we'll be hosting this afternoon that highlight some of the most pressing issues that face working people today and the work of our fellows and colleagues in advancing research in these areas. So as Sharon mentioned, this first panel will focus on labor and climate. Dr. Jacob Wertheim is an associate professor in emergency medicine at Harvard Medical School and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and is in the Department of Global Health and Populations at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Wertheim's research and teaching is focused on complex humanitarian emergencies and digital health implementation science in resource poor settings. Max Kiefel is a former Wertheim Fellow and the Associate Director of Innovation at the Center for Labor and Justice Equity. Prior to joining our team, Max received his PhD from the London School of Economics and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School. Max's research on the intersection of labor and climate looks at how workers are responding to the energy transition with a specific focus on the electric vehicle industry. And this panel will be moderated by none other than Sharon Block, Executive Director of the Center for Labor and Justice Economy and Professor of Practice at Harvard Law School. And of course, as most of you in this audience will know, Sharon led the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Biden administration and played a key role in advancing environmental regulations that shape the administration's climate agenda. We'll leave a couple of minutes at the end of each panel for Q&A with our audience. And so we encourage you to hold on to any questions that come up during the moderated discussion with our panelists to ask when we open up the floor. I'll turn it back over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Yuri. Okay, so this panel is, you might wonder, like, these are 2 people from very different parts of sort of the climate justice world. But the panel is going to focus on the intersection of labor and climate, about interventions in the context of green industrial strategy and heat action plans, and our work with communities that have been affected by climate change and policy. So why pair these 2 incredible people? And the idea in pairing these people, Satya and Max, is that climate change poses extreme danger for working people, but in 2 different ways, for both their physical well-being and their economic well-being. And we need to attend to both threats. And so we wanted to show how we are thinking about addressing both of those challenges for workers. So Satya, I'm going to start with you. So thanks to your research, we now have a better understanding of the impacts of heat on workers' health. So what have been the implications of this data on heat-related policy efforts for workers, and maybe share with folks sort of how you've been doing this research and how we're working together on that?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to play in. 90% of the labor force in the global south, in countries like India, are in the informal economy. So all that we talk about, labor rights and worker protections, are hard to apply to 90% of the labor force. We talk about street vendors, construction workers, waste recyclers, so on. chip breakers. I would parallel to here that chip breaking with something that was actually done by hand under very conditions in some of the hottest places on Earth. Sharon and I have long been associated with the Self-Employed Women's Association, which is a 50-year-old organization, collection of trade unions and cooperatives and labor unions that now have a membership of nearly 4 million women that identify as self-employed. So they are from the informal sector. A few years ago, they paired with Rockefeller and some others and launched a parametric heat insurance product. It was so hot for these women to continue to work. When you talk to them, they said, we bake from above and below. It's hot from the skies, it's hot on the asphalt that we sit in to sell our produce, our vegetables. It is impossible to work. And so they paired with the Rockefeller Foundation to launch this product, and then the Atlantic Council called a parametric heat insurance product, one of the first of its kind in the world, which triggers on a very hot day to give a little daily wage to the worker so she can stay at home and not work. 2024 was one of the hottest years on record when the product was launched, and it did not trigger. And so they reached out to us and said, we heard there's some smart people on your campus, can you help us figure out what happened? And so we dug in, and some of the problems were with the way these definitions about heat waves were made. Making up this number, but let's say it's 45 degrees centigrade, 45 degrees for 3 days and 3 nights continuously, right? So if it dips to 44 at night, it doesn't count. But the street vendor looked at us and says, well, I'm very confused. If you're trying to protect my wages, why 45? My produce starts decaying at 42. So shouldn't you trigger it at 42? And that sent all of us down a very deep rabbit hole, because we tried to answer the question, how hot is too hot? And it depends on what you're trying to measure. Is it too hot for this building to cool down? Is it too hot for me to continue to do my cut piece stitching and embroidery in my ill-ventilated home? Is it too hot for my child to walk back from school because she doesn't have footwear and the asphalt burns up? We're following 1,000 women across 8 different sectors for 13 months with Fitbits on their wrists and microsensors measuring temperature and humidity in their home and work environments to produce a data set of about 9.5 million person hours of the direct impact of heat and humidity on physiology, wages, and well-being. This will be the first time that the medical sciences will have data in the lived experiences of the poor. All the information we have in our medical textbooks on the impact of heat on labor comes largely from Caucasians in the armed forces in the US, our athletes, and a few plantation workers in Latin America and in Africa. And so that is sort of the information that you were referring to, and the implications, which I'm hoping we can discuss a little bit later in the hour, have significantly shaped how we should be thinking about protecting the vast majority of the labor force.
Great.
Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you. Max. So now we're going to look at that's the physical and the work that we're doing together to think about these physical implications, but it's impossible to sort of to separate that from the economic impact. So Max, can you tell us about your research that started looking at the green transition in Ohio and Tennessee, and what have been some of your major takeaways about how workers see the climate crisis, and how you've come to gather that sort of on the ground knowledge and how the project is evolving?
Yeah. Thank you as well for having me, and also, as was mentioned, I am a former fellow, so it's great to receive this. So we started thinking about this project in early 2024, which feels like a long time ago now, but we were really interested in sort of what the Biden administration was doing in terms of the rollout of green industrial policy. And we were very interested in what role the labor movement specifically was playing in ensuring that any decarbonization project, any move from the fossil fuel industry towards a green energy would be a just transition. And by the time we got into the field, and by the time we were doing our field work, there had obviously been a change in the federal administration. So that question was on the back burner. That meant, though, that we could ask a sort of different type of question. And so we were interested, the way I saw it at least, was that there had been a sort of policy bet under the Biden administration. And that was in order to sort of win back the support of the industrial working class in places like Ohio, to some extent in places like Tennessee, you had to sort of provide jobs and sort of rebuild communities that had suffered sort of profound deindustrialization over 50 years. And so by reintroducing manufacturing in the electric vehicle industry in particular and battery plants in particular, there was a sort of policy bet that we could reincorporate, that the industrial working class would be reincorporated into the sort of democratic coalition. But as we saw in 2024, this didn't happen. And so why was this the case? What has sort of happened there? By interviewing workers themselves that are working in these plants, we sort of sought to untangle that question a little bit. And so we partnered with the UAW to interview their members in 2 plants that were run by Ultium Cells, which is a joint venture between General Motors and the Korean electronics giant CLJE. And as well, we interviewed UAW members who had recently unionized the Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And sort of to distill the problem, I think we can just focus on the Ohio plant, which is in Lordstown, Ohio. It's in the sort of Mahoning Valley area. And what happened there, like Youngstown, which is the biggest town in the Mahoning Valley, it had been the second biggest steel producer in the US for 100 years. And in the space of 5 years between 1977 and 1982, they lost 50,000 jobs as the majority of the steel mills closed. And for a brief period, General Motors filled the gap. So they only recently opened a battery plant, a car assembly plant. And that sort of provided some employment. And these were very good jobs. They were well paid, they had good conditions, and they were unionized. But unfortunately, for a variety of reasons over time, that plant itself declined and closed in 2019. So when Ultium was reopening a battery plant on the former site of this GM plant in 2022, it had significant symbolic experience. For a lot of the workers that we spoke to, their parents had worked in that plant, and they knew what it sort of instilled what a good job should look like. But unfortunately, when they went to work at the Ultium plant, that wasn't the reality that they experienced. There's a conception that the green energy industry will be a clean energy industry, and that's not necessarily the case. For these workers, they're expecting to work in an auto plant, and what they found was a chemical plant. They're working in extremely hazardous conditions for $15 an hour, and that's not what they'd received at the former auto plant. So for us, the big takeaway was that the UAW itself was able to organize that plant to ensure that those jobs were what those workers expected. And so a big takeaway is that it's not as simple as just bringing jobs back. They have to be good jobs. And for that, that's the role that the labor movement has played.
Great, thank you. So now let's get a little bit more into sort of how we do our work. And so Sajid, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how in the time that we've been working together on this project, how we brought together the law school, you're at the public health school, the medical school, we've developed a relationship with the Kennedy School. I think there's some other like H something S's involved in our work, because it's such a multifaceted problem. So if you could share with folks sort of how the project, like what we've done together so far, and then where this is going or where we hope it's going.
We have a couple of climate scientists and maybe an economist. We work very closely with 2 others in the audience, Raj Naik and Karthikeya Patotia here at Karthikeya's at Kennedy School, and we will hear from Raj shortly, and many of you know. These early findings from the study, simple stuff. Paint the roofs white, paint the roofs cool, green the roofs, great. And then what happens? And the temperature decreases by a couple of degrees, so it's successful. And then the World Bank or some multilateral development bank wants to roll out millions of dollars to paint every roof white. And what we found is that the child was still not sleeping better, that 2 degrees was not enough to change sleep quality overnight. What we found is that these women were remaining tachycardic with a heart rate above 100 for weeks at end in the summer. What we found is that the wage loss was so tightly related to temperature that on very hot days, these folks that were daily wage workers were losing about 60 to 70% of their wages. And I could go on and on. It was very clear that we could not just continue to function in this medical public health space, and we were directly dealing with massive policy implications and implications on labor and productivity at a national scale when you start thinking about countries like India or Bangladesh and the implications for the millions. And Sharon and I met over conferences and events about the informal economy, but very clearly realized that there was so much we could do to inform our teams collectively from both vantage points. So working with the Harvard Global Health Institute, we have this wonderful network of about 40, 50 scientists, policymakers, practitioners from thermal physiologists to labor law experts from around the world that have met at a regular cadence to try and map where the scientific evidence is for the range of worker adaptations that are being promoted around the world. Do they actually work? There are absurd sort of solutions like, oh, we'll give them these cooling suits that they're supposed to like walk around wearing. And, the vast majority of laws, including the US, are still trying to struggle to get workers the right to a water fountain and toilet breaks. I kid you not, this is what we're debating in the United States in 2026, is whether people should have sanitation breaks and rest breaks, right? And so how do we sort of change the conversation around what dignified labor looks like? And that's where it's been at least very useful for the non-law human rights trained members of our team to learn that there is hope and collective action from US.
Yeah. One thing I will just interject, I have loved about our work together is a lot of Sachin's work takes place in the global South. We have found it, as somebody who's done domestic policy in the United States, we have a lot to learn. This is an area where we have a lot to learn from the global South. It's obviously gotten hotter faster there. We are catching up quickly, certainly in the Southwest. And so it's been this great exchange between people who might not always work together and sort of American, a little like hot take, American exceptionalism of like, we don't have to worry about this stuff because we're, an advanced economy. Like we need to be worried about our own informal sector, our own workers where it's getting too hot to work. And so it's really, I think, expanded in both directions. How we think about this work. So obviously we are the Center for Labor and a Just Economy. Sometimes labor just means laboring, people working, but it also we focus a lot in our work on the labor movement. And so could you just expand on what you said before? And I think this is relevant in both of these dimensions of the role that the labor movement is playing in the dynamics that you're seeing particularly in Tennessee and in Ohio, and sort of how in your political science sociology world, how the labor movement figures into solving some of these problems.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one of the big takeaways from the last sort of 5 years is that we clearly can do a green transition. We have the technology, we have the capital, but in order for that green transition to be a just transition, we really do need the labor movement. And I think the case of Ultium Cells, which is the battery plant that supplies the batteries for GM's electric vehicles, sort of in both Tennessee and Ohio really illustrates this, where, through the UAW, they were able to win a contract. And that has sort of profoundly changed the experience of working in green industry for the people of those plants. And I think it's sort of helpful to think about what the union contract act, like what difference that union contract actually makes for those workers. And I think that, when we think of what unions do and what a contract achieves, we can think of better wages and we can think of more job security. And I think those are really important, and they were certainly very important in these plants where wages were raised from sort of $15, $16 an hour to $32 an hour, which was life-changing for a lot of those workers. But I think the big thing was also, and this is sometimes maybe missed in what unions can achieve for workers, is that it's about safety. So if we think about what goes into a battery, a lithium-ion battery, which is like the batteries that power electric vehicles, the chemical compounds that go into this have only been invented in the sort of, or discovered, whatever term you want to use, in the last sort of 3 decades. The last time OSHA was able to update its regulations on these sorts of chemicals was in 1971. So the workers that go to work in those battery plants are working with chemicals that are completely unregulated in the United States. And so when they went to work before the plant was unionized, they did so without proper protective equipment. And so when we interviewed those workers, what we heard was the wages are really bad, and I could be earning more at the Amazon distribution center down the road or at the McDonald's on the corner. But I'm also bringing home chemicals that I don't know what effect they're having on me to my children. And so that was like a really powerful sort of distillation of what work was like at that plant. And almost overnight, the UAW managed to channel what work meant at that place, because workers very quickly had the proper protective equipment. And because the UAW itself has done a lot of research into what these chemicals can do to people, the exposure limits were properly regulated at the plant. And so work dramatically transformed. And I think that's a really helpful case, because as I was sort of saying before, we think about the green energy transition as wind turbines and solar panels. But for the people that actually work in manufacturing different components of the green energy transition, it's messy and it's hazardous. And so we really do need the labor movement, particularly given the broader regulatory environment of the United States, to be able to sort of bring working standards up.
So this might be a little bit asking you to speculate, but as we've seen with the current administration, sort of the rollback of support for this transition to electric vehicles and for addressing the climate crisis, I wonder if there's anything you've heard with workers, or what you would, what we might probe in the future about how UAW members think about sort of the politics of the climate crisis, how that's influenced by either not being represented and being subject to these kinds of conditions, or the role that the UAW is playing in changing how they think about this transition.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in terms of the effect that the Trump administration has had on the electric vehicle industry, it's still unfolding, but it's been immediately disastrous. The electric vehicle industry has stalled. So the 2 plants that we did research at, the 2 Ultium Cells plants, there's one in Spring Hill, Tennessee, which has been repurposed to build, so they no longer manufacture batteries for electric vehicles, but instead they're doing so for data centers, which I'll eventually get into later. And for the plant in Ohio, they have laid off the workforce. So half the workers have been laid off permanently, the other half have been laid off temporarily. They were supposed to go back to work this week, but that has now been delayed to August. And so while GM is still working out what they're going to do with their electric vehicle industry, we're sort of waiting to hear what's going to happen. And so one might expect that the workers in these plants would be immediately outraged at what the Trump administration has done. And sort of curiously, that hasn't necessarily been the case. What has happened, I think, instead, is that we've seen a sort of depoliticization. So for workers in sort of Ohio particularly, the closure of the plant, or the semi-closure of the plant, sort of feeds into a a longer term narrative about the place in which they live. And so, as I was sort of saying before, Lordstown is part of this sort of steel producing industry region that has sort of suffered sort of 50 years of deindustrialization. And so rather than experiencing the sort of semi-closure of Ultium as a discrete political event with a clear villain and a clear cause, it sort of seems to confirm a narrative that the community in which they live is one of decline and sort of has negative associations. And I think, unfortunately, that's a really it's a really hard narrative to budge. And I think that is what we sort of need to focus on doing. And that's what sort of I think the unions are doing a little bit to focus on this. And that's where we certainly want to take the next stage of our research project. So I think one thing I want to focus on moving forward is this idea of community memory. And so rather than the memory of what the community used to be, being a sort of like negative, cynical vision for why we can't have good things anymore, it can be a resource for good federal policy. And so I think that what we want to do at the Centre is sort of work out how community memory can be a resource for policymakers and actually include it. Because I think that's how you actually start to change these narratives. So that's, yeah.
Well, thank you for a little bit of an uplift there at the end. Sachin, I'm going to ask you to follow Max's model. This is, these are tough conversations. Is there something you can share with us about developments that are giving you hope in this space? Something.
Healthcare's latest paper on anticipatory financing. So these working with organizations like SEVA and all the labor unions that you work with, I think it's always so encouraging to see that people aren't waiting around for other people to come and help them, and they are crafting their own solution. The cost of adaptation to heat is already being borne by the workers, right? They figure it out. They need what they have to do to protect themselves. There's a group of over a few thousand vendors, we've included men this time, that work with the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute. And they have demonstrated that anticipatory financing is a better way to go, not wait until there's a disaster and then, fill out cash, but say, we know it's going to be a hot summer. And AIDMI went and asked all these vendors what they needed. And they came up with little pots of money and they studied what they did. And most of them would invest it in improving a little bit of their working conditions, a little tarp to have an awning that shades their cart, a bottle if they are driving so that they can carry water, an ice chest so that they can keep their vegetables cold in the middle of the afternoon. And a sentence that really struck me from this paper is that it said that what we need is not the hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure to protect these people, but the tens of dollars that they're asking for made available to them so that they can figure out how they can protect themselves as a start.
Right. Well, one thing that is giving me some hope is that and it's a little early, and I'll just be shameless and say we are still looking for the resources to ensure that we can do this work, but we are starting to hear from organizations and even city governments in the US who want to also do this research, modeled on the SEWA project. And so we're really excited about figuring out, what does this mean for construction workers in the US? What does this mean for food vendors in cities? I mean, I'm sure most of you have spent time in New York in the summer. Imagine, standing over a hot dog, with the boiling water or whatever. And then also delivery drivers. So stay tuned. Hopefully we will have even more to report and sort of translating this work into the US context. All right, we want to now open it up to questions. I know we've got a lot of folks in the room who know a lot about climate and labor. And so Yuri will share a microphone. Sit. Oh, there, sorry, Jaya, I didn't see that in.
Cool, well, thank you so much for that, and my understanding of the center's impact is particularly in the daily operations of labor unions, so I think a few instances where you see this work showing up in practice and UAW being really good partnership. Max, I mean, who do you see as kind of the culprit in this story of yours? In that, you know, it sounds like labor unions themselves are quite mindful of some of these challenges. And so where do you see, like, who's not mindful of what's some of these findings? And then secondly, I think just transition's been limited to climate, but I think we're in the midst of a much bigger transition that's going to impact workers in places like the East Coast of the United States, not Middle America, and how that might be applying to some of your research, I imagine might come up in Michelle's conversation as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the fill-in question is
So many.
yeah, I mean, there are some, it's very difficult to not be, when, you know, part of the process of this project has been sitting down with workers and members of the broader community in the places that I've done this research, and it's hard not to be compelled by their experience of sort of outsiders coming in, promising the world and failing to deliver and leave. And I think that, you know, many times those outsiders come in, they are wanting to be helpful. They are wanting to do good things. So there's a kind of, you know, it's not necessarily always just like an evil person sort of taking jobs out, although that's happened. But I think that, like, so what we need then to go forward is to not treat investment as a blank slate for this on this community, and to actually incorporate what has happened in that community to move forward in order to sort of move past that. And then in terms of the second part of your question, I mean, again, just going back to I found the Ohio case study so fascinating because on this one site, this old GM assembly plant that was closed in 2019, you have the battery plant on one corner, and on the other corner you have SoftBank and Foxconn opening a facility that will produce components for data centers, and then on another corner you have a proposal for a data center itself. So you sort of have three different directions of how the American economy can go on one sort of plot of land. And what's really interesting is that Lordstown, which is a tiny little village of a couple of hundred people, has passed a moratorium on data centers. And so this is the flagship case in the Ohio Supreme Court at the moment for whether data centers can go ahead. And so in terms of that question of community memory, I think it's really interesting that we are now seeing communities that have experienced unjust transitions, be it a climate transition or be it the transition away from heavy industry towards the services economy, using that memory and sort of taking that through the policy process. And I think that that's like a really important thing going forward in terms of how we think about data centers as one component of your question on AI, I think is something that gives me a little bit of hope in terms of how this is going to play out.
And I just want to highlight something from what Max said and the incredible value of Max's work. And hearing about this like community memory piece has really driven us at the center to do a lot more listening. And so we've built in often with our Wertheim fellows, this kind of participatory research. So Max is going to Ohio, Yuri's been going with him too, to Tennessee. We brought a number of Starbucks baristas here for a day and a half to just listen to how did they think about what they have accomplished or not accomplished in their organizing. Michelle is doing some very deep participatory research, which I'm sure she'll talk about later, with clerical workers who are at the sort of front line of the AI transition. In our scholarly, and I always do that, scholarly working group, Kurt is laughing at me, we had representatives from the AFL-CIO, from SEWA, from other sort of grassroots worker organizations, because we don't want to make the same mistake of not really listening to what workers actually want and what they think the answers are and how can we have that exchange. I think we have time probably, oh, yes, Mary Gray, hi.
Hi, thank you for this panel, and I'm curious if both speakers can address if you see environmental justice organizers and movements in the intersection of environmental justice activists kind of picking up and finding solidarity with workers. Often I see as the Venn diagram of those folks, particularly in rural parts of the United States. But I'm curious if you're seeing those organizers lifting up what workers' needs might be also part of their needs.
Yes, a little bit. I think particularly as we're sort of taking the research project forward, we are sort of, and I guess this is like a big factor in the American economy is the data center question, and a lot of the sort of curious coalitions that are developing around the data center fights. We are seeing some trade unions working with environmental groups in rural Tennessee and in rural Ohio, which is not necessarily where you would expect these organizations to be popping up. So on that question, we are definitely seeing that, yeah.
I think there are areas where the overlap is obvious. So when you think about the rural countryside and farmers, there is overlap between the environmental justice conversation. There is also overlap actually with some of the just transition conversations as well, in particular northern Indian states. Where this is missing is just a lack of recognition is the worker in the informal sector in the cities of the global south, which is hundreds of millions of people. And that's where I think the environmental justice conversation has still not intersected with the labor movement in the urban global south. And the gig worker is not seen, the delivery driver is not seen as the epitomization of all these different sectors yet.
Yeah, it was fascinating at this conference that we participated in, helped organize in India about a year and a half ago. We had a leader from the gig workers union in India, and it was sort of like, I don't think he had really been in that space before with the environmental activists. And so it was a very rich conversation about like how could they all work together and how could we all work together? So that's a great question. Thank you. I think we are out of time. Mark will sure Mark will have many questions on our other panels too. All right, join me in thanking.
Thank you so much, Sachin, Max, and Sharon. We'll move right along to our next panel, which will focus on labor law and policy developments. So I'm going to ask Raj and Ben to make their way to the front. So I'm happy to introduce, starting from the far right,
Say nobody ever about HIPAA, I just have to say.
Direction-wise. Hima Hafiz is an associate professor at Boston College Law and teaches in rights in labor and employment law, antitrust law, and administrative law. Her work focuses on strengthening workers' bargaining power and legal solutions to labor market concentration and inequality. And from 2022 to 23, Hima served as an expert advisor on labor competition issues at the Federal Trade Commission. Raj Nayak is a Wertheim Fellow currently at the Center for Labor and Just Economy and a policy consultant. Most recently, Raj served as the Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor and has previously served a range of senior roles at the department during the Obama and Biden administrations. And at CLJE, Raj does research and writing on strategies to promote worker power. And this panel will be moderated by Professor Benjamin Sachs, faculty co-director at the Center for Labor and Just Economy, and Tessa Baum, professor of labor and industry at Harvard Law School. Pass over to Ben.
Great. You hear me? Okay, good. So what a pleasure to be on a panel with you too. Our goal is to talk about what in many ways is the traditional core of the work that the center does, and that is labor law and labor policy. Of course, we'll quickly see that labor law doesn't just mean labor law anymore. many things, including antitrust law. So I want to use both of your experiences as fellows and as academics and as policy experts to sort of highlight some of the ways that we approach labor law reform at the center. So, Hiba, let me start with you and ask you to tell us about your journey from being a Wertheim Fellow to being a professor at Boston College, and also to take a chance to say what you've been working on recently.
Thanks. Well, I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so honored to have been a beneficiary of the incredible community that the Wertheim Fellowship has built and continues to build. So I was a Wertheim Fellow between 22 and 23. That was during my pre-tenure leave. And I was able to both serve as an expert advisor at the FTC and also continue ongoing research that I had been doing. At the FTC, it was kind of early days of figuring out how to do labor antitrust enforcement to challenge the anti-competitive conduct of employers in labor markets. And it was still very experimental early days. Hence the need for having kind of a collective, think tank within the agencies, both the FTC and DOJ, of figuring out how to operationalize antitrust enforcement in the context of employer power abuses. And so while I was there, I was able to work on the non-compete rule and enforcement actions against non-competes. We also revised the merger guidelines to incorporate analysis of labor market effects in merger analysis, challenged the proposed Kroger's-Albertsons merger on labor market concentration grounds, and also drafted important guidance internal to the agency and for regulated parties on employer merger disclosures, how Section 5 of the FTC Act should encompass unfair methods of competition, or what we call UMC in labor markets, how to think about the relationship between unfair competition and consumer protection in the context of labor markets when it comes to employer deception and surveillance of workers, particularly when they have market power. And also figuring out how to improve interagency coordination between DOJ, FTC, and also the NLRB and the Department of Labor. So that was kind of work that I was doing as I was serving, but I was also researching an article that was later published in the Penn Law Review that was focused on how federal labor market regulation had contributed to geographic inequality, so kind of overlapping with Max's work, actually. And more specifically, how labor and employment law, but also macroeconomic policy, trade policy, fiscal and antitrust policy enabled concentrations of employer power in place-based ways, in ways that had reduced workers' earnings and wage growth, workplace quality, and also access to economic opportunity in rural and distressed communities in particular. So the Wertheim Fellowship was really kind of a unique opportunity that allowed me to do expert advising in government while also doing academic research. And that really enabled a kind of cross-pollination that I don't think I otherwise would have gotten, that was really beneficial for my thinking and for my scholarship. And being able to advise on labor antitrust policy from within the government gave me a new perspective on how different the labor and wage policies of the antitrust and labor laws were in practice, even if they were identical on paper, right, on the face of the labor and antitrust laws. So I saw firsthand how we were deploying antitrust laws in ways that were entirely divergent from the labor and wage policies that the Clayton and North LaGuardia Acts had laid out, right? Policies that were laid out again in the National Industrial Recovery Act and also the National Labor Relations Act, to both antitrust and labor law, not only to support workers' collective institution building inside the workplace, but to remedy the aggregation and development and deployment of employer power under antitrust law with government support for worker-led institutions. So my service kind of drove me to write another law review article that emerged from my time as a Wertheim Fellow that I ended up publishing in the Columbia Law Review, that traces the history of labor antitrust policy in the progressive era as one that was focused on promoting worker power through unions and collective bargaining to achieve union premium wages with corporate employers, and how current labor antitrust enforcement that was influenced by the Chicago School and had usurped those policies in favor of focusing exclusively on achieving more competitive labor markets to help the marginal worker achieve competitive wage rates, something that the progressives had rejected as leading to race to the bottom wages. So for them, making sure that workers could exit one bad employer for another ignored the fundamental problem of corporations' government-granted power to aggregate, right, and coordinate capital through the form of the corporation, while leaving workers only to act as individual wage negotiators, ignoring the importance of voice and worker-led institutions in sustainably challenging employer power. So I would propose finding ways to return back to the statutory fidelity of the Clayton and Northwood Board Acts in our antitrust enforcement. Right now, I'm working on a couple new projects that are first a book-length project that just under contract with Princeton University Press that emerges from my research as a Wertheim Fellow. And it's documenting not only federal, but also state and local labor regulation that has concentrated power in employer power in place-based. It's called Unfree Labor, the Legal Geography of Work. So these would include things like the use of municipal bonds in the South to lure northern manufacturers to towns by guaranteeing employer monopsony through a number of legal mechanisms. Most importantly, bonds that promise not to grant similar incentives to competing employers, but also promising worker training with no pay on firms' specialized equipment rather than training workers in general skills, promising manufacturers that workers would pay the city for plant construction through wage garnishments, and paying employers for lost productivity if workers strike. These legal instruments and others were at the core of the Southern economic development model that relied on prioritizing business interests and guaranteeing cheap pools of low-wage labor through hostility to unions, labor protections, and strong safety nets to ultimately limit workers' subsistence on anything other than low-paying jobs with usually one, maybe two employers. So this model isn't just about policies and deal making, but is grounded in legal infrastructure that intertwines public and private political and economic authority through municipal financing, tax abatement, property laws, and employment contracts enforceable through the courts. So the book is going to trace the kind of historical arc of place-based labor market making through law, from Reconstruction to the present, and most importantly, how the Southern economic development model was standardized, rationalized, and spread through local chambers of commerce, governor and mayoral associations, federal and local workforce development boards, and other associations to countless rural and distressed communities across the country, when the New Deal and War on Poverty programs were replaced with new Federalist block grant funding and financing that left training, workforce, and economic development models to local elites, read local employers, in charge of critical labor market infrastructure. So coming out of my sabbatical year, I kind of expanded a focus on this kind of legal place-based generation of employer power from focusing exclusively on monopsony or buy-side power, market power that employers have to economically coerce workers to accept infra-competitive or below competitive wage rates, to thinking more about governance power. So thinking about democratic theory and political theory of what economic democracy could and should look like, and how intertwined economic and political power can become in local oligarchies in rural and distressed communities, and that the solution to those problems isn't just about figuring out novel economic policies, but thinking also about political solutions and rethinking how our administrative state and how our economic institutions can also function as political institutions that genuinely empower workers in place-based space.
That's great. So one thing that brings up is the relationship between academic work and policy work, government work. And Raj, before becoming a Wertheim Fellow at CLJE, you spent many years working for the federal government. I'm curious how you drew on or learned from or took advantage of academic research while in government.
You know, totally all the time. Oh, can you hear me? Does this work? Uh-oh. Hang on. Hello?
Yeah.
Better, okay. Thanks, Ben. And just briefly, thank you for having me today. And it's just been so exciting to hear more about the Wertheim family. And it's necessarily the community that the fellowship has created and all the kind of ripples of that community in academia, in government, and otherwise. So it's really exciting to be here. I think that Ben, you have this really key question. I did spend about 10 years in the Department of Labor between the Obama and Biden administration. More than half that time on regulation, on working with Sharon. Regulations, at least the way that we did them, had to have an evidentiary basis. They take forever to make. They were better when Sharon was running OIRA for that time, keep time. But anything we want to do in government, and I think people was talking about this, you kind of need some research going in, right? It's like you can't really like just produce the research that minute. So it's really important the reliance on the existing participatory resource that's going on from Wertheim Fund and otherwise is really key to being able to accomplish anything. So, for example, we worked on my first couple of years in the Biden administration, a lot of rules around COVID, right? Which was as we were in the middle of and coming out of the pandemic. And we needed that epidemiological research on protecting workers from airborne viruses, research that had come up before COVID even was a thing that we talked about as the evidentiary base that we needed in order to find ways to protect workers later and to justify those ways. Research has gone a long way since. I was thinking about Adam Dean, who's a great political scientist at GW, who did a great recent report for the center, included a study on how the enforcement, harkening back to our last panel, of California's heat standard has reduced heat-related deaths among outdoor workers by 33%. And then when you add in more enforcement and better standards, it got to 51%. That was research sponsored by the center that both did a good job of exploring what is the impact of doing a heat rule, and it'll really help in any future administration at the federal level and today at the state level to justify having heat standards for workers. Adam, I was thinking of in particular because he released a paper in 2022 on the impact of unionization on COVID transmission in nursing homes. He found that unionized nursing homes had a 6.8% lower worker infection rate and a 10.8% lower resident mortality rate than non-union nursing homes. This was important because then in the Biden administration, when the Department of Health and Human Services was working on a rule to provide staffing ratios and lower staffing ratios in nursing homes, looking at that research, we could argue that engaging workers in the development of the plan to implement these ratios was really important because, again, you can see the impact not on workers, but on the health and well-being of residents. So we were able to ensure that under that rule, which I think is being repealed now, the workers that are representatives were at the table in the development of these staffing plans. One more example, thinking about law professors, for example, there was a great paper written by Mark Linder, Bruce Goldstein, Larry Norton, and Kathy Ruckelshaus in 1999 called Enforcing the Fair Labor Standards in Modern America, the Modern American Sweatshop, Rediscovering the Statutory Definition of Employment. This paper really goes back into the history of what it is to be an employee, into the definition in the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is employee includes the sufferer permit. And that language, which came from early child labor laws, which was intended to be broader and more encompassing than the common law doctrine of employment. They pulled the statutory history, they talk about it in a very compelling way. And then thinking about like the early amicus briefs that we found in the Obama administration around misclassification and employees being classified as employees and not independent contractors, we cited a lot of the research they brought up. And you could kind of see through the case law that was coming from that, echoes of this language. Are you actually in business for yourself? Are you a small business? Are you suffering from any work? And that case law led to the groundwork that became an administrator's interpretation around misclassification, that the first Trump administration repealed, and then the Biden administration put back into a rulemaking that the Trump administration is repealing. So we could talk about rulemaking as a particularly problematic vehicle, but I do think that that research is really important to follow.
Great, well, as a law professor, I'm glad to know that somebody reads law review articles.
They're often cited.
Yeah. So I want to ask you both sort of really about what you think the biggest labor law questions being debated today are. But I want to invite you to start by reminiscing, as it were, about what the big labor law questions were when you were when you were a fellow, and then to talk about what the big questions are today. And then Raj will get your sense of what the questions are today.
Yeah, okay, so it's
Way back when, 3 years ago.
way back when, honestly, when I was thinking about this question, I was like, oh, that was 4 years ago. It was
Different time.
exactly, kind of thinking back to the world of questions that we were dealing with in the Biden administration. It was certainly a time when we knew that the PROACT Plus reforms were dead in the water, so that we weren't going to be relying on new legislation that could help build out, worker unions more broadly through the country. And so the question really was, what can we do in the absence of that? And I think, at the time, the questions that were being debated were like, what kind of authority can we use the NLRA to enable in reforming and easing ways to protect workers' Section 7 rights and enforce against unfair labor practices by employers in ways that are both innovative and aggressive. And so I think, when I was a Wertheim Fellow, the core questions were really like, with Jennifer Abruzzo as the general counsel of the NLRB, drafting memos to basically create a list of potential precedents for more expansive protections in the NLRA for worker organizing, dealing with misclassification issues, dealing with joint employer status issues, dealing with employer surveillance, dealing with captive audience meetings as ULPs, thinking about what the authority of the board might be in ordering collective bargaining in the context of employer unfair labor practices, and also thinking more expansively about the remedial authority of the agency and really making employers pay for violating the labor law through having them pay workers for direct or foreseeable pecuniary harms that result from their unfair labor practices. So it was really what can the administrative state, what can administrative agencies do to really enforce our congressional mandates in ways that fulfill the purposes of the statute in the absence of the other two branches kind of laying stagnant or maybe even undermining the scope of authority that the board had. And was doing in the context of the Glacier Northwest decision and Cedar Point, which really, was limiting union access to farm workers and really filling workers' strike activity to use their economic leverage when it was most meaningful for them to go out on strike. And so those were the questions. There were also really novel questions being debated around labor antitrust, which is kind of where I was focused. And really, those questions were massive, right? It was for most of the past century, or since the National Labor Relations Act protected worker organizing more effectively than the labor exemptions to antitrust law had in 35 and on. There hadn't been enforcement of antitrust law in labor markets against employers or employers. What's the flip side of monopoly power? Monopsony power and exercise of anti-competitive conduct in labor markets, of employer collusion on workers' wages, wage fixing, no poach agreements, non-compete agreements, and more broadly in the context of merger policy, for a long stretch of time, for around 50 years, the antitrust agencies would credit as merger-specific efficiencies, worker layoffs, as something that would be a potential pro-competitive benefit of a merger. Right? So this is something we had to kind of unseat and reverse and figure out, okay, how do we do merger policy in the context of this history? And also the FTC Act, which hadn't really been applied in labor markets against employers, was really expansive, right? It gave the agency authority to challenge unfair methods of competition and gave it within its own expertise, the authority to decide what counts as unfair, right? So when you think about it, that's massive power to think through how can we use expert evidence, how can we use law review articles and research that could be done and that I was also, before serving, had been doing in part through being a Wertheim Fellow, to really figure out the contours of what counts as unfair conduct in labor markets. And so that was a kind of open page. And so I think we were thinking about how do we delineate what that is in ways that would be sustainable by courts. We're very suspicious of agency action and the exercise of agency authority in labor markets. And I think we can talk about this more, but I think we saw that as creative and innovative as I think in the Biden administration enforcement apparatus and all of the amazing people that were working in the agencies was, we're limited by what the courts were willing to authorize, and we were limited by congressional inaction. And really, advancing and reforming the labor laws to match the challenges of our current labor markets. And so much of the work that I had been doing at the FTC was challenged and abandoned by the current administration. And so I think we're now in a moment, maybe I'll switch over of what are the questions being debated now with you as a Wertheim Fellow.
Well,
presently.
It's a good segue. I mean, it's not surprising that one of the things we're thinking long and hard about, and I feel like this is a through line for what Sharon and Ben have been doing for a long time, which is what's the right role for the federal government and the states when it comes to policymaking with respect to labor law. This is not a new question, although some people do say that pro-worker folks, or at least federal folks like me, just rediscover the states every time the federal government is less hospitable. But it's all the more important in a world where the Supreme Court's been chipping away at the National Labor Relations Act for such a long time, and there are serious and existential attacks on the law itself. I want to call out our colleague Yuri, who together with the team put together this fantastic toolkit on what cities and states can do now, right? What are ways states can build power now? What are ways cities can build power? Everything from covering workers and providing bargaining mechanisms for workers who are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, tapping into procurement, spending authority, creating navigators to help, union navigators, worker-centered navigators to help folks administer programs, and even worker board. And again, Yuri and co-authors put together this new study of the Harris County Essential Workers Board, which is worth checking out, thinking about how worker boards can be an element of building worker power at the state and local level, even in our current context. But beyond that, as there are these questions now about where should states go if the hopefully still unthinkable, but not unfortunately completely unthinkable possibility of the Supreme Court completely eviscerating the National Labor Relations Act happens. Together we've been working, Sharon and Ben and Seema, our colleague over there, have been working on this question with a series of academics and advocates, including him actually, and law professors and economists and others, thinking about where do we go, and we've launched a series of working papers on this topic, covering everything from more ideas about sectoral standards. We are thanks to the SEMA and HIPAA and others, we are hopefully soon going to have some model language for what state level sectoral bargaining standards could look like. Thinking about using payroll deductions to fund work organization. What can cities do in terms of employment security and just cause protections? Ways that, again, in this transitional moment, in this moment where there's this attack on the federal law, how could states and cities be ready to fill in the gaps and to empower workers in the process? I should also say Ben and former student, I think, John Fry, have just published a really fantastic law review article on the same set of issues. And so, maybe I'd say like, I'm hoping that someday there's an administration that goes in and says like, I'm gonna go and fix all the things that that HIPAA was working on that are on the back burner, and the enforcement that SEMA was doing at the Department of Labor, and everything Sharon has done over the years. But until then, and maybe after then, we should really be thinking about how states can step in and how we can use that kind of authority to give people hooks to bolster organizing at the state level as well.
So let me use that as a chance to segue to a question about both of your work over the years, and you've been engaged with CLJE in a number of ways, including both of you on the Clean Slate Project, the original Clean Slate Project, and the more recent work, as Raj, you were just describing, around state and local innovation. And as given the sort of fragility of federal labor law and the risks of either sort of severe curtailment of federal labor rights or the complete evisceration of them, what is there that makes you optimistic about policy going forward? And just an invitation to talk about the relationship between antitrust and sectoral bargaining, if you feel inclined to do that, because you've been so incredibly helpful in us navigating through the thicket of antitrust law in the direction of developing a sectoral bargaining statute that could actually survive antitrust scrutiny.
Yeah, sure. So, okay, where can we be helpful? Absolutely, one of the ways of being, one of the things that gives me hope is the sectoral bargaining project that CLJE has been focusing on, and also instantiations of it that have emerged, and at the state and local level, in California, here in Massachusetts, in Detroit, in the industrial standards boards, and so on. So I think there are active models that are kind of in operation. But I think what the idea is, to the extent that the Supreme Court limits, erodes, or eviscerates the National Labor Relations Act, and even in some contexts if it doesn't, sectoral bargaining boards can allow for industry-wide worker collective bargaining that can lift wages across an industry. And so the coordination that we're kind of conceptualizing in the context of, potentially versions of tripartite commissions that go back all the way to Jacob Wertheim learning, is what does it look like to have coordination, not just between workers, but between employers as well within an industry, that are deciding what wages and terms and conditions of work will look like across the industry. Right, workers have an exemption under the antitrust laws to coordinate with each other and collectively bargain. Employers don't, right? Employers are actually prohibited from coordinating on wage fixing and deciding amongst each other that they're going to set any kind of wage, even if it's a union premium wage, right? Regardless of what the actual amount is, they're prohibited under the antitrust laws from coordinating. So setting up an infrastructure where we can have tripartite bargaining without any antitrust violations requires complying with a kind of series of cases from the Supreme Court that lay out when states and also local actors, municipalities, can create institutions of collective bargaining where employers are coordinating with each other and with workers in figuring out industry standards for wages and terms and conditions of work. That requires, under what's called Parker immunity, the state to take on an active role in supervising that essentially employers are not violating the antitrust laws. They functionally immunize the coordination between employers through that active supervision. But there are pros and cons of that, right? The pros are that you get some kind of tripartite commission that really resembles what, I think European standards are for stabilizing some level of union premium wage and stable protective working conditions across an industry. So that employers who fear unionization don't fear unionization, because it will put them at a competitive disadvantage with their non-union employer competitors, right? It just takes it all out of competition. And now all of the incentives to union vest, at least some of the incentives to union vest, at least are reduced, right? So there are all sorts of benefits that can come from it. But then the costs are that it could allow for, where workers aren't unionized, could allow for employers to just collude with each other, and to the extent that they, there's some level of corruption or some level of political influence, co-opt the state active supervisor of the process to functionally end up reducing working conditions and wages below what they otherwise could be, right? And so there's issues surrounding the extent to which a sectoral bargaining regime is compliant with existing Parker immunity requirements under antitrust law. So there's potential legal challenges to these types of setups, but there's also kind of maybe economic, social, political challenges that can arise from setting up tripartite type commissions in the context of really, really low union density. We don't really have a lot of models for this empirically to assess. I mean, we have had models of this in our own country with the establishment of NIRA labor boards and other forms of coordination during the Depression era. And there was significant collusion, employer collusion during those periods, but there are success stories that I think we can draw from there, and that I think we can look to current instantiations of sectoral bargaining to really study and understand best practices for getting the benefits of sectoral bargaining without the potential.
One of the things I'm most proud of is this sectoral bargaining report, which SEMA has been really instrumental in helping us put together. But listening to you sort of teach a group of labor law experts what they need to know about antitrust law was really a terrific experience. So Raj, what are your thoughts about optimistic sources in these times of, sort of blatant attacks on the federal regime of labor rights?
Well, first I'll second. I feel like I've learned so much about antitrust and now it's back on the surface. And we have a fantastic RA who worked with us on this too, Liana. But at this time, one thing I'd say is it's hard. The one kind of source of optimism is the general support out there for worker organizing, right? There's like something in the air. You see the Gallup poll and other things that show that, people are interested in organizing. There's still this gap between the interest in organizing and the ability to organize. So we're seeing, folks who are interested in unions but can't, because of legal constraints and otherwise, can't quite get there. What I found really interesting was a couple of years ago when Sharon was testifying before, oh my God, I think it was the Senate committee, the Senate Health Committee on the Starbucks worker campaign. I used to going to these hearings and just watching. This was probably in 2023 years. I was still in the administration. I just wandered by and watched Sharon testify. And I was expecting that the opposition to the Starbucks workers would be the standard. Unions are just there to steal your dues. Unions are there to get in the way of your relationship with your employer. But it was a fascinating hearing because the folks who were more union skeptical were saying, look, I think unions are pretty great. I think unions are actually important in manufacturing and dangerous occupations. I just don't think they're right for Starbucks or for retail or for coffee, right? And so you heard this really different, this different kind of opposition. I'm thinking even like Senator Matt Braun, who I had a fun conversation with when I was my confirmation hearing mode, who was like, oh, I'm totally for unions. It's all good, except not here. Different. And I think it's in part because of that interest in that gap we're talking, or not the gap, but the interest we're talking about. And that's probably not unrelated to why you see again, I want to be open that this is like a little optimism and a little challenging, right? There's the Faster Union Contract Act, which is like a tiny slice of the PRO Act, which is moving through Congress right now. And folks might have seen last week it reached the level of signatures it would need to get a discharge petition. Like it's going to get a House floor vote.
because there is a bipartisan push to do this tiny little piece of labor law reform. Is it near enough? No, not in the least. Are there some folks who are behind this who maybe I don't love on many issues and we could, and I, I defer to others to think about like pros and cons of passing little pieces of things. But I do think that it shows that there's an interest out there in the world to really rethink that gap of the people who want to join unions, and maybe gets us to the point of where kind of clean slate style reform can come in later.
Yeah. So thinking about all this and moving ahead, what are the areas of research that you think are most important? For the next generations of Wertheim fellows, like what would you hope they would focus on?
Oh my goodness, I have such a long list. There's so much to research, I think, in part because our labor markets and labor conditions, labor production are changing so rapidly, and so much more rapidly within one micro generation than we've ever seen. And so figuring out how to adapt a legal infrastructure, worker protections, and allow workers the ease and protection of their Section 7 rights in a constantly changing economy is just incredibly challenging. So I'm excited that there is funding for this future research. One of the things that I've been really excited about and that I think could be the subject of future research too is the success of the recently certified Massachusetts App Drivers Union. So I've been seeing, I just moved back to Boston from being away on sabbatical for the year, and I saw all the bumper stickers up of App Drivers Union, bumper stickers on non-rideshare cars. I was like, yes. There's a lot of solidarity for this. It's just an incredibly impressive actualization of what was, I think, a really, contentious battle of figuring out how to secure protections for rideshare drivers to organize and collectively bargain. And so now we have 70,000 workers in Massachusetts that have a union. They petitioned. There was the question 3, which was passed, it was a ballot initiative passed in 2024, so just a year and a half ago. The petition required a 5% threshold for organizers to get coworker information, and then a 25% threshold to petition for certification. 25%, so that's like 17,000 plus workers, and these are workers who do not work in the same workplace, do not speak the same languages, and do not have the same hours. And managed to build solidarity across the state in ways that really brought together a coalition of organizers and lawmakers and policymakers and nonprofit groups and unions from that I was surprised were working together to really build out the potential for the ballot initiative that could serve as potential future efforts across the country, including in California, where we created a similar path. So, I mean, I think that studying how that was possible, but also figuring out now that it's in place, like what are the strengths and limits of doing this kind of organizing outside of the protections of the National Labor Relations Act with workers who are explicitly independent contractors without the protections of the labor and employment laws, even in a state where we have the ABC test passed, and it would be really easy to qualify as an employee.
Yeah, I agree. Great. So Raj, I'm getting the 5-minute signal. I'll give you 1 minute to give research topics, and then we'll try to take a question or two.
So we've been talking a lot about the stuff that didn't survive the Biden administration. One thing that did survive was and I wasn't very involved in this, we spent a lot of time trying to make sure that the government dollars going out in grants and grants especially, had labor standards on them. That's led to this like giant intramural debate on the everything bagel and are we trying to do too much, and we can talk about abundance. I do think that there's a lot of evidence on this, on the question of whether labor standards do or don't drive up the cost of public contracts. And I think the evidence is pretty good that they don't. I do think that being able to build in more of the more research and more evidence on how coming up with a good strategy for implementing this, doing it early, and then carrying it out could make development not take any longer, but could build you the coalitions that are kind of pro-abundance in the process, or not. You can find that out in the research. But that's my very quick pitch.
Okay. So any questions in the time we have left? Seema.
I'm gonna ask a very unfair question because it's one I'm not sure how I would answer, but I would love to hear your thoughts, Ben. Thinking about the rapid decline of unionization over the last 40 years and the critical place we're at and its implications for things like heat, worker power, disparity. If you could have one policy that could be legislative that you think would best address increasing unionization in our country or creating conditions to do it, what is it? Is it sectoral bargaining? Is it something with preemption? Is it something with antitrust? Just one thing.
So you want me to answer that? Hey, thanks, Seema. So when we put out the Clean Slate report, it was like 170 pages. And I got the same question from every reporter, which is, if you could choose one of these policies, which would you choose? And I always said the same thing, which is, I resist the question because what's needed is a new system of labor law, not bits and pieces that stand alone. This is to sort of Raj's point about the fast contracts bill, but a whole new system. And I sort of wanted to resist the temptation to say, well, but there's one thing. And so I stick to that position and say what we need is a complete rewrite of the labor laws along the lines of the Clean Slate Project, because all of those things work together to create a whole. If forced to choose one policy, like if you said, if you don't choose, you don't get anything, I might go with just cause dismissal, because a national just cause dismissal policy would shore up organizing around the country, and everything builds from there. So the idea would be it's a foundational right to not be fired except for good cause, which would protect union organizing rights. But really what I think is we don't need one thing, we need things. But anybody else, any takers?
Yeah, okay, have one. Federal job guarantee. Yeah, so to the extent that federal workers still have labor protections, having a public option would force private sector employers to compete with the federal government for good jobs, good wages, and collectively bargained participation in workplaces in ways that would allow workers to select out of bad employers into good employers, namely the federal government. I also think it's really important in the context of geographic inequality that we think expansively about what a federal job guarantee would fund, particularly in the context of AI and displacement. I think care work, whether that's elder care, child care, forms of healthcare that are provided in the home, even by family members, reproductive labor, all of those could be considered federal jobs because they service our national economy and enable labor productivity for the production of goods and services in our GDP. And so I think thinking through how a federal job guarantee could expand employment opportunities to rural communities beyond what our industrial policy currently serves would be incredibly beneficial for figuring out how to increase union density in rural and distressed communities.
And briefly, I'd say I agree. I think both of those are fantastic. I've been thinking about like just that moment last year when we just saw federal government contracts getting slashed across the country and the weird tentacles of impacts that had, things that I wouldn't have even expected. I do think if we would take a step and say, we think that federal dollars, whether they're contracts or grants or otherwise, state and local dollars, the trillions of dollars that states spend every year, should end up in good jobs. That could have, and that good jobs could include the right to organize and a real kind of protected right to organize. That could have a big impact, and we could take advantage of that, again, those kind of tentacles of like all the money that's out there.
So please join me in thanking Raj and Eva.
Welcome back, everybody. We'll get started with our third and last panel of the day. That's the last. Like anybody else. So this third panel session will focus on tech, AI, and motivation. And I'm pleased to introduce Mary L. Gray, who's a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research and faculty associate at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. She maintains a faculty position in the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering with affiliations in anthropology and gender studies at Indiana University. Mary is an anthropologist and media scholar by training and focuses on how people's everyday uses of technology transform labor, identity, and human rights. She earned her PhD in communication from the University of California at San Diego in 2004 under the direction of Susan Lee Starr. In 2020, Mary was named a MacArthur Fellow for her contributions to anthropology and the study of technology, digital economies, and society. And Gabrielle Ridgely is a senior fellow at the Workers' Rights Institute at Georgetown Law, where she researches the intersection of rights, labor, and technology. Her research reflects her experience facilitating working groups, lobbying for racial justice frameworks and federal antitrust and tech policy, and designing public education materials. Gabrielle will be joining Wisconsin Law this fall as an ex-Hasty Fellow, and she earned her JD from Georgetown Law and BA from the New Jersey Institute of Technology as an Albert Dorman Scholar. And this panel will be moderated by my colleague, Michelle Miller, who is Director of Innovation here at the Center for Labor and a Just Economy.
Thank you so much, Lori. Before we get started, I want to do a microphone test and make sure people can hear me. Can everybody, even in the back, you feel good? Okay, I'm going to use my labor organizing voice.
I was going to say, Henry, can you hear us?
So it's really great to be here and very humbling to be a very small part of the legacy of Jacob Wertheim and the incredible contributions that he made to labor research and labor scholarship. As you already noted, I am the Director of Innovation at CLJE, and before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit about how CLJE approaches the question of labor and technology. It is one of our core areas of research. And the reason for that is because what we have seen is, much like climate and much like changes to labor law and much like many of the other things that we've talked about today, technology has the potential to dramatically and radically reshape how people are able to survive in the future. And that the difference between a future in which there is dystopia and abstraction and fear and control, and a future in which workers are able to share in the benefits of what technology can provide is entirely predicated on their ability to shape that future. And so the question of industrial relations and the questions of labor management partnerships and shared benefits is core to the questions of how we are going to organize ourselves around technology in the future. And much like the research that my colleagues this morning talked about, we have focused our research heavily on the direct experiences of workers who are on the front lines of artificial intelligence displacement. I am personally researching clerical workers who have a 94% exposure rate to experimentation with AI in their work. They are mostly working class women. They are often sole providers for their families. And they also often are the people who do all of the administrative unpaid labor in families. And so they kind of have this dual role of being both workers who are impacted by displacement of artificial intelligence in their workplaces, and then consumers who are interacting with artificial intelligence systems and automated systems when they are trying to secure benefits or use banking systems or sign their kids up for education classes. And so they are the cutting edge. And I was struck by the comments during the heat and climate discussion about the fact that a lot of high level research is based on sort of like trends and data analysis, but not the direct experience of people. So you can decide to paint the roof white, but the kid might not still be sleeping. That is exactly what we're seeing in our research on artificial intelligence, that so much is missing when we write broad reports about how it is impacting workers' lives. And two of the people who have taught me the most about how to think about what it's like to be a person within these complex systems are sitting next to me. And so I'm very glad to have them here. Gabrielle and Mary, I would love for you to start by talking about what you've both been working on lately. And I'll start with you, Gabrielle. Like, based on your research and your work, what are the implications of tech regulation or any kind of AI policy that does not take into account the kinds of power imbalances that emerge out of these kind of complex systems?
Yeah, so first, I want to make sure I can be heard, and I'll move my mic if not. But I want to just start by saying thank you for the invitation. It's really exciting and humbling as a junior scholar to be on a panel with two women whose research has really like shaped my approach to this work. And to start, at the Workers' Rights Institute, I'm working on a framework that is an alternative to the current approach to labor organizing and policy. One that is looking, oh, sure. One that is looking to, one that's looking to combat the ways that racism and technology have been used historically to undermine worker rights. And so that's in part looking at Black feminist theory as an analytical framework, as well as labor history to identify the places where those moments in time have occurred. And as a Hasty Fellow at Wisconsin Law, I'll be continuing this work, and in particular, researching and writing about how to strengthen federal labor reform legislation to advance stronger worker protections. And so with that context, my approach to how tech reform needs to take these power imbalances into is really thinking about that history. A lot of what we're seeing with AI, both generative AI and a more expansive definition of that, has already occurred, but we've already seen a lot of impacts at play. And that context is often missing in conversations at the federal level when thinking about regulating this technology. And so it's key for us, one, to acknowledge the history of attacks on worker autonomy, to identify the values being advanced by technology and management practices, as well as ensuring that we're using proper levers to prevent this erosion of worker protection. And so Amiri Baraka and Ruha Benjamin are two of many who have discussed how technology reflects its creators' values and intentions. And so when we think about labor management, who are the major forces for developing the technology to manage workers, they oftentimes have a hostility to worker autonomy and well-being. And when I use the word worker autonomy, it's not in the same way that the gig economy does, right? It's not this sort of like entrepreneurial spirit, but really thinking about worker autonomy as worker self-determination, allowing them to create better material conditions. So as our fellow panelists have already discussed, right, thinking about better pay, better terms and conditions of work, better job security, health, things of that nature. And so when legislators don't have that historical context, bills oftentimes do one of two things. One is the bill is good for some workers, so independent contractors oftentimes are being excluded from these protections because the laws are only amending the laws that are written for employees. Another example that we see also is that it's a good bill with an exception that swallows the rule. So one example of that is a business necessity exception. So with the Stop Spying Bosses Act that was introduced by former Senator Casey, this was a bill that would prevent the use of surveillance and automated management in the workplace, especially if it was harming workers' health. But there was this little clause that kept showing up where employers would be allowed to use the technology if there was a business purpose for the surveillance. And so if you have a business model that's developed around surveillance, then you will allow an Amazon then, even though there's research showing that the surveillance is harming workers, Amazon can argue that there's a business purpose then for the surveillance, and therefore doesn't have to comply with this law. I could talk a little bit more about the history of that if there's time, but what we really need to see is that the legislators are taking this historical context into play and thinking about expanding, one, who is covered by these bills when they're passed into law, and also closing loopholes to ensure that workers have access to these labor protections. And so to wrap it up, pass it to Mary, also just want to uplift something that Ben stated on the previous panel about just cause and how important that is in protecting workers from the harm of surveillance. There's the Secure Jobs Act that has been introduced in Illinois, and a sectoral version of that that's been introduced in New York City. And what happens is that when there is a prohibition on why workers can be fired, the bills have also limited what can be used for for discipline. So there's a limitation then on what employers can track and how they can use that. And by doing so, legislators are taking this disciplinary role of surveillance out of the hands of employers, which then should, when passed into law, then allow workers to, again, have the autonomy and able to protect their rights and ensure that they have dignified jobs.
Thank you. That was incredible and comprehensive and pithy. Mary, I would love it if you could also share about what you've been working on. I've had the privilege of being able to talk to Mary about this quite a bit, and it's really incredible. How are researchers and communities collaborating in ways that are empowering workers and working people?
Yeah. So doing a mic check. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I've spent about the last decade studying how much human labor goes into making artificial intelligence work. So if somebody who builds artificial intelligence tells you that it's going to replace workers, you can tell them they're wrong because they've never actually studied people working. What they have is a pile of data that's the output of some decision made, but no idea how complicated work is, and particularly how much when people are working together, they're often deliberating. It's not about just the one decision. You're constantly thinking about what do we want to do next? And often the most important thing you're doing is having the debate. That debate is entirely off the books for AI. It has no way to understand that level of complexity. So what I studied was how often AI cannot accomplish the very, what seemed basic to us, but are incredibly technically hard challenges of complex communication, being able to make a snap judgment with no priors, no data at all. People excel at that. And actually, it's not individuals who excel at that. We collectively excel at that. So I come at this studying this very interesting moment where the idea that people are replaceable, and particularly the industry, my employer, who believe people aren't that complicated, is facing the reality that most of the things that could have been automated, the kind of rote, never changes, it's on rails that never move, that's been automated. That's why manufacturing is not booming, but service economies are. So the economic reality that this technology is coming at the same time that what we have left for us as work is a lot of care work. And most of what I study now, it's studying the care work, the contract labor, the contingent workforces that make services, particularly social services, function. After that research of how much collaboration is happening among a lot of individual agents, particularly in data labeling, content moderating, things that people didn't even know were jobs that people did, I shifted in COVID to think about the case of community health. Community health is effectively a lot of social services. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry of caring for people. And so what I wanted to study was, particularly during COVID, how many organizations, that organizational structure, that's basically a small business. It's Main Street. All of the small businesses that make transporting someone who has mental health issues, only speaks Vietnamese, and needs to get dialysis to a place that they can go is an incredibly complex task that is coordinated among a lot of small organizations, and they're hyper-local organizations. So it's a fantastic test bed for being able to see if you're working with organizations that are frontline staff. Typically, they are not organized in a formal sense, but they are ripe because they have solidarity. So it's the most, so much potential in an organized workforce that already knows how to navigate supporting each other as peers and being able to find the places where they want to collaborate and where they don't. And the potential of those organizations showing us exactly what are the fault lines for AI systems where they should not automate a process. Because these folks have already figured that out. They have to deal with the reality that no technology has ever been built for what they do. So a lot of what I'm doing with community organizations in parts of California and Illinois, Arizona is setting up pilots where we can co-design with these community-based organizations that already govern how they interact with each other so that they could flip the model and no longer have to sell off their data or be forced to hand it over, but actually their economic model can be all of the insights and expertise that they hold. If they control that, if they literally don't ever have to hand over data again, which is both a record of community members who have come to them for help, it's also a record of their work. It's a record of literally everything they've done, that they would be able to not only control that data, they're in the best position to make use of that data. So the future of AI, whatever it'll be, it'll continue to depend on insights, data. It's going to always need data. And the thing we can change right now is exactly who controls that data, who governs it, and who gets paid for the value of creating it, rather than having it extracted away.
And one of the reasons I thought that Mary would be such a great panelist for this particular symposium is that that feels like an updated version of the profit sharing initiative that, you know, we talked about, that Jacob Wertheim was interested in, that data is so much more than just bits of information. It is an enormous profit center. It drives the economy in the 21st century, and we have to take it very seriously as something that's valuable. I think another thing that both of you made me think of is this idea of complexity, that often when we talk about economic efficiency, when we talk about profit, what we are talking about is minimizing complexity. And I have been doing a lot of work in the public sector and work with public sector clerical workers and people that are delivering benefits to communities and other people that are doing government work. And when I think about complexity in that context, I think that it's also democracy. Complexity is democracy. 100%. Complexity is the thing that pulls systems apart and creates entry points for the complications that all of our lives contain, for the complexities that are within us and that require the state to meet us all where we are. And that, I was listening to a scholar talking about how the vision for converting the federal government into an AI kind of state is really about autocratic control. Yes. Because it's much easier to release dictates and have them performed without all of those pesky people who know what they're doing saying, I'm not sure this is a good idea and people might get hurt. And so that sort of pushing back on those narratives of efficiency and frictionlessness and cleanliness and re-embracing that human complexity is something to be celebrated, I think is going to be very important going forward. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about the way that I think you rely on Black feminist thought to celebrate that level of complexity, and the way that I have felt that Black feminists have helped me understand how you operationalize a complex system versus like a frictionless system.
Yeah, I think also like Mary, when you were talking about the production of knowledge through conversation, that's something that's really core to Black feminist thought as well, where I don't know the answer, but so I'm going to talk to Mary, who may have a different lived experience than me. She has an alternative source of knowledge, and that's going to then help us solve this problem that I may not have encountered before, but Mary has, or Mary has encountered something that's a sliver or something that's a shade of something that we're experiencing now. That democracy is so important because oftentimes, and this is an experience that many of us have experienced, where you're talking to an automated voice. You call, say, your pharmacy, and you have a problem that the system isn't coded for, right? There's that simplicity that is necessary because there are limitations to what the technology can do. And so now you're coming with this complex problem. The algorithm doesn't know what to do with you, and therefore you don't have a solution. And so that's why that democratization, right? That like, let's expand what is being considered. And that complexity is so important because we live complex lives. And oftentimes when that complexity is being erased, if you're not falling within a very particular, when you're in this silo, if you're not in the right silo, then there's not going to be a solution for you. But we don't live lives as singular beings. We all have complexities and different layers of what Black feminists would call, you may be at a different, you're experiencing this matrix of oppression. And so you're not just a person, you're a person who has a certain class membership. You may be an immigrant, right? You may come from one state and living in a different state. There may be these different things that, if it's simple, you may be falling outside of the scope of protections. And so thinking about that complexity is so core to understand this is the world that we live in. And so until we address those places of oppression, of privilege or not, then we have to be honest about that reality and address it that way instead of ignoring it.
Can I pick up a comment from that? Because I think one of the most valuable things about having this fellowship program here is that it is an open research question how we're going to have technical systems account for social complexity. So in the same way that technologists would be nowhere without computer science, they're now building effectively open social systems. We will need to figure out how to bring social sciences. Black feminist thought is like the most important body of theory in sociology, for example. That's the stuff computer sciences never had to think about. This is not their jam. You do not want to leave computer scientists trying to figure out societal needs. And so I think in a lot of ways, my aim as an anthropologist is to say, we are at a new phase of computer science. If you think about biosciences, this is my current book project. If you think about biomedicine in the 60s, it had lots of ways it thought it needed to investigate the world that we now look at as wholly unethical. Like you don't just take indigenous folks, you don't just take Black and brown people who have no say or no power and experiment on them because you can. That was not an obvious, and it was actually a heatedly debated point in biomedicine, certainly from the 20s onward. The same need for computer science to update, it is incredibly responsible to society, and you can't just deliver something and see what happens next. That's not just morally bankrupt, it's bad methodology. So as a dilettante about methodology, I would say when we're talking about lived experience and when we're talking about co-design or participatory design, we're talking about a tradition in social sciences that says you have to actually study the social world. And you can't do it from an arm's length. You actually have to see and talk with the people who are involved to figure out what would be the next best move. That's the future of technology. And this place could be the place that says one of the most important sites to work this out, it's the site of workers working with these technologies. Because workers always are bearing the brunt as much as any parent. with any technology thrown at them that's supposed to improve their lives, see More Work for Mother. If you haven't read that book, highly recommend More Work for Mother. Proves every time you build technology, it does not in fact make your life more efficient or better. It creates expectations and different standards of what are we doing next. And that's a good thing if we think about what we could do next with AI. It's a terrible thing if you think technology is going to save you.
Yes, nothing will save us but us. I didn't mean to get all, whatever. Anyway,
That's true.
but you're making me think of, as you were talking, I think that we have been told a story about technology that it is a matter of science or that it is a matter of economics, and that these things are to be solved through policy. But I listened to Henry Farrell, the scholar, the other day talking about AI as a social technology. Yes. That is absolutely a way that we are now organizing social relations, that we are thinking about how bureaucracies work, and that, to your point, this simply cannot be left to computer scientists. They've done a nice job, not always, but
they try really hard. Actually, that's the hardest thing. I went looking for maniacal actors in studying all this contingent labor going into building AI. And literally, I kept meeting dudes who were just like, no, I don't really think about the people because I don't have to. I'm making this other thing. So they're missing things, but they're not all bad actors.
Yeah, no, the great thing is we all really like talking to people. And so we can do the talking, and as long as they listen to all of us.
Yes. Therein lies the problem.
Before we go to Q&A, I just wanted to ask you both quickly, like, where do you think scholarship on tech and labor should go next? I mean, we've heard a little bit from you, Mary, about that. I'd love to hear from you, Gabrielle, on that question.
Yeah, I think something that's like key. So from my background as a lobbyist, a lot of times when we would talk to staff on Capitol Hill about here's this policy that we think you all should be legislating, it was also to underscore what Raj and Hibba said earlier, right? There was a need for academic cosign. So even if we were saying, we have X members of our organization who are constituents of Senator Y, it was like, okay, cool, but what have the professors said? So it's really important for there to be scholarship then that is supporting innovative and aggressive, really pushing the envelope in terms of like, here is a solution. Let's think through like what that looks like. What do we need from Congress? What do we need from the agencies then to ensure that workers' rights are being protected? And so I think that's a really broad category, but oftentimes I acknowledge that as a scholar, as somebody who is removed from organizing, from the lived experiences of workers, the organizations that are organizing those workers, who are talking to the folks on the front line, they're in the best position to say, like, we need X or we need Y. And so just wanted to, again, like, underscore what our former panelists said as well, of how important it is to be listening to workers, because they know, even if a lot of times in the Beltway, folks will say like, oh, workers don't know that they're being surveilled, or workers don't know that they're being managed by algorithms. And that's like so far from the reality, right? They may not be able to say that it's technology Z, and this is how this is what data is being collected, right? They can't tell you, they can't walk you through maybe the finer details, but they know, they're experiencing it. And so I think it's really important for that scholarship, one, to elevate the expertise of these workers, but also to think through like, what are the solutions that they're asking for, and how do we actually get it into practice or into place?
Yeah, I will say I came here from having been the executive director of a grassroots organization, and I cannot tell you how many times we would see something happening that workers would be coming to us with. And it was the research and scholarship of people like you all and others who helped me to be able to make sense of the things that I was seeing. And frankly, to do that translating work, because if you are talking to a number of different audiences, you have to be able to say, like, the thing you already know here, let me reframe it so you understand that it's happening here. So, everyone has an opinion on AI, which I have learned because every time I tell them I work on AI, they have opinions. And so I imagine that everyone in this room might have an opinion on AI. And so I wanted to open it up for any questions or comments from folks.
Thank you. Compelling panel. I guess I'll take the liberty of introducing myself. I'm Stan Gassick. I'm the Senior Advisor for Global Strategies at the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union, representing 1.2 million working women and men in the United States and Canada, including in the IT sector. Also I'm here because I had the good fortune of being a Wertheim beneficiary in 2008 to teach a course, Sociology 191, on labor law, and the history of solidarity in the Americas. So my question is this, I guess principally directed to Gabrielle on this, and that is, in terms of your own research and what you're doing at Georgetown, and I understand that the political conjuncture is not real propitious right now in the United States in terms of getting real regulation through. We knew that the current regime basically revoked what efforts were made by the former administration on executive orders to try to regulate a bit. But I was curious if you could comment on regulation and whether the Georgetown and other other research institutes in the academic world are looking seriously at comparative efforts on regulation. I'm speaking most particularly on the EU, European Parliament legislation, which is not perfect, but it does effectively say it's overly high risk and banning with regard to cognitive behavioral modification, social scoring, and some biometric identification are really trying to confine it to just strict law enforcement purposes. So I'm just wondering if that's informing the debate, if there's an active look at those sorts of comparative examples. And I don't know if you can speak for Microsoft here with it, but I just also wanted to flag a point that Microsoft is in active discussions about the possible kind of global framework agreement or global memorandum with the global labor movement and with the Uni Global Union, which is a organization which my union is very actively involved. Thank you.
Yeah, so there definitely is a look at what's happening in the EU. Oftentimes the EU is a model of what is possible, right? So we're seeing what's happening there, thinking about like the AI Act or even the GDPR. Oftentimes there is an issue of how it's like, what does it look like actually when it comes to enforcement? Oftentimes, like, especially with the American tech companies, they sort of are like waving off whatever the EU is doing, which is a huge hurdle. I mean, the equivalent here in the United States is that if you introduce a strong bill, the tech companies are going to lobby against it and it's not going to move. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done to having the influence that the tech companies have over what is passing, because it's incredibly anti-democratic for, voters to want something to pass, thinking about like antitrust updates to the antitrust laws, and for the big tech companies to essentially say that like this isn't going to move out of committee. And so just like those are some of the dynamics that are at play that folks are discussing, but I'm not one of the folks who's looking very closely at what the EU is doing, but I have colleagues who are, especially, as somebody who's coming from organized labor as well, that organized labor as well as thinking about like what's happening with their affiliates overseas and learning from what's moving there. There's one other point I wanted to add as well, and just that personally, I do think that there needs to be a lot more work to push Congress to pass strong laws, especially the panel right before us was discussing. The courts are so hostile to agency action. And so with the new acts of Congress that we will get in our lifetime, right, having either really strong enforcement and grants of authority to the agencies to then shore it up from these attacks on the delegations of power, or just in the law already, it's right there and we don't need agency action to do as much of the work that the abdication that has been occurring recently.
I'm gonna jump in on the comparative thing and then hand it over to Mary. Is that okay? We're doing, in our research on clerical workers, we're actually partnering with researchers in Poland who have taken our methodology with the women clerical workers and replicated it for women clerical workers outside of Warsaw. And what has been really interesting is that in the US context, those clerical workers are mostly born in the US, are multiracial, and have what are represented as pretty good working class jobs. In Warsaw and outside of Warsaw, many of the workers who are doing those jobs are refugees from states experiencing civil strife, specifically Ukrainian refugees. And so the relationship to AI is quite different for those workers. On one hand, there's a concern about displacement and making it so it's harder for refugees to get jobs other than cleaning jobs. On the other hand, the refugees are able to use AI to work in another language that is not their native language. And so it is actually a benefit to them. And so how do you wrestle with those complexities? And then I would say the second thing is that the researchers we've been working with have also been thinking about how EU countries are building a technological stack that is not dependent on US tech companies. And when we think about monopoly from a global perspective, I think it would be of tremendous benefit to everybody for there to be a viable competitor to American technology companies in order to maybe see some differences.
Yeah. Do the traditional, I can't speak for Microsoft. And actually, I'm at Microsoft Research, so I can say things that absolutely appall them out loud in public. So, the thing I would want us all thinking about is it is possible to address the entire life cycle of AI because it's software. That's actually the one thing you remember I say out loud. AI is software. It's new software. It's really powerful software, but nonetheless, it is software. And it has two ingredients that are new to us. It's using a lot of data and it's using a lot of computing power. So whoever controls computing power and controls amassing data controls the future of AI. The one thing we know is that right now, companies like mine, dominate owning all of the computers. The reason it has to have all those computers, it's running statistics over and over and over again along all of those data sets it has access to. If you can get control of productivity data, particularly shared productivity data, you've got a lever for change as a labor organization. If you, as a contract worker, are able to have any sort of law, like the sweatshop laws that we have that in California, they were trying to amend to say if you have unfair labor conditions or forced labor in creating AI, we won't procure your product. We will need accountability and auditability of that kind of supply chain. But if you focus on the work conditions, you actually have a way in to control AI, not only as workers, not only as governments, but as consumers. Don't you want to know who had a hand in making this stuff that is supposed to make decisions for you? So there's so much opportunity right now in thinking of this as for workers, regardless of their status as fully employed, or for global majority that has not ever had the chance to think about the conflict of being formally employed or informally employed. They're all gigging it. What is going to be the way that connects us all, given that all of us as workers are producing the data that is this new software? Control that data, you've got to weigh in.
Amazing, thank you. Do we have, I got the, thank you both so much. I learned so much every time you talk. Thank you all.